Hello, so welcome to the next panel for YA ThrillerCon. As I'm sure you'll see, this year we've extended the reach of our con, so we're now looking at multiple different genres other than thriller and different readerships. And I'm really excited that today we're going to be talking a lot about middle grade stories. So I'm joined by three fabulous writers, and I'm so excited to be talking with you all today. So we've got Marisa, Sarah, and Sophie. And yeah, we'll start with just some introductions. So Marisa, would you like to go first, introducing yourself and your latest book?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Marisa Noelle, and so far, I've written loads and loads of YA, and that's what I've got published at the moment. But I do have a couple of MGs on sub with my agent. So my latest book that I've had published is The Unravelling of Luna Forrester, which is like a Little Red Riding Hood retelling, dark and creepy. So that's on the YA side of things. And yeah, I think that's everything. Did I include everything I was supposed to include? Yeah,
You did,
hopefully.
yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent start. Sophie, would you like to go next? Yep.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sophie Cleverly. I'm the author of the Scarlet and Ivy series and the Violet Veil Mysteries series. So both middle grade mystery. And my newest book is the second one in the Violet Veil Mysteries, which is called A Case of Misfortune. So yeah, I write a lot of mysterious, spooky, adventure style middle grade books.
Yay, that's just the sort of stories I love reading, like anything spooky and mysterious. Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Absolutely. Hi. Yeah, so nice to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me on. So my name is Sarah Ann Juckes. Previously, I was a YA writer with Penguin. My two books, Outside and The Law Between Us, were published in 2019 and 2021. And then my latest one is middle grade, so I've kind of hopped over to the dark side, as I like to call it, on the middle grade side. I don't have a copy of my book to show off in English, but I do have the Dutch edition, which is the English one just looks exactly like this, but it's paperback and not hardback, and it's in English. This is The Hunt for the Nightingale, and it's got really nice illustrations throughout by Sharon King-Chai. I'll see if I can get some actually, because she's just the most wonderful illustrator.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
beautiful.
It's like illustrated with birds throughout, and she's amazing. And for middle grade, I tend to write more on the literary side of middle grade, contemporary adventures. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
So exciting. Yeah, so my first question for you all is about how you got started writing middle grade stories in particular. So Sophie, we'll start with you for this one because you're onto your second series now. So I'm really intrigued to know how it all began.
Yeah, so I actually started when I did my degree in creative writing at Bar Uni. And we had a module in writing for young people. And it was just my favorite module that we had. It was something I hadn't really tried it before, but whenever we had that class, I just really enjoyed it because I felt like there was a lot of freedom. A lot of the other classes, it felt like there was an expectation to write things that were literary or a certain way. And yeah, I just really loved the freedom of writing kids' books. And I was trying all sorts of things from like picture books to young adult. Yeah, and it was when I was having a lesson and we were given a writing exercise to imagine someone setting foot in a room that they hadn't set foot in before. And I pictured this room with twin beds in it, but only one girl going into the room. And it straight away gave me this idea for a story about a lost twin. So I started writing Scarlet and Ivy, the Lost Twin, in that class. And I just carried on, basically. I wrote it for the rest of the class on my undergrad. And then I ended up doing the Masters in Writing for Young People as well. And again, just carried on writing that book the whole way through. And it did start off more as YA. I was thinking it was going to be YA, but it ended up becoming middle grade. So I've kind of moved from one to the other as well.
Oh, that's super interesting. Yeah, I love hearing about sort of the things that sort of spark the idea. Just that sort of like writing prompt about a room. because I always find that my stories always begin with sort of one specific image, and then I just sort of like write to discover what's happening, and then it just goes from there and evolves into something that I would never have realized I was even going to write, because I don't plan at all. I just dive straight in and see where it takes me. So Marisa, how did you get started writing middle grade then?
Yeah, it came as a bit of a surprise because, you know, I would say YA is my happy place, and I write horror and dystopian and fantasy and all the dark and twisty things. So when I started writing middle grade, it's a contemporary road trip adventure about 3 orphan siblings who are all neurodiverse. So one of them has ADHD, one of them's dyslexic, and one of them's autistic. And it's modeled on my 3 kids, who also each one has one of those diagnoses. And I, over the years, you know, had seen them struggle with various different things at school, and also, you know, particularly my autistic son, he's very highly functioning, but, you know, we still had a lot of struggles at home with just understanding him and him communicating and the emotional side of that. And I just wanted to write a book for these children who had a label, and actually particularly highly functioning children, because I think they get forgotten about. I think it's very obvious when somebody needs a lot of support, but when someone's kind of coasting along and gets missed, I think it's those kinds of kids that kind of know something's wrong with them, but don't know what to do. So I just wanted to write something that they felt, even though they had this label, it was still offered them strength, and they still had things because of that helped them overcome things because of their diagnosis, not that it wasn't just an obstacle. So it came very much from the heart, this book, and it is one of my heart books, and I just hope that this is one that's on submission at the moment. I hope it will get out there and help some of these other kids and make them feel that these things aren't as important as they might feel they are.
Yeah, it sounds like such an important book. Obviously representation is just so important within children's stories. So Sarah, how did you get started with middle grade in particular then?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I started off writing, as everyone does when you're a kid yourself, really, and kind of making up stories. And then I just didn't really stop writing for the age group. So I wrote my first book when I was 16, not the one I ended up getting published. It was a terrible book, but it was a YA book, and then subsequently I wrote a couple of other YAs as well, as I was learning the kind of craft of writing. And so I was just used to being in the YA zone, but I've always been very interested in younger voices who are dealing with things that are slightly darker, slightly more adult, and then bringing that kind of innocent head into that and thinking about, because one thing that really gets me is that like kids have to deal with really huge things that happen in their life, and whatever happens to kids needs to be represented in children's books, if you're just talking about you, Marisa, as well. And so I've always been really interested in that kind of younger voice, that kind of more innocent voice, and tackling those more difficult subjects. So a friend of mine had always said to me, you should write middle grade. Why are you not already writing this? And I just didn't really have the idea. And then an idea came to me whilst I was watching an episode of Spring Watch. Spring Watch is amazing. And the idea just landed in my head, and so did the voice, and everything else just kind of came out of that. And I've just fallen in love with middle grade. Like it's a brilliant age group to write for, especially with school events that you're doing, engaging with those kids who are still in that I don't mind showing how excited I am phase, rather than the I'm too cool to show this that you get with teenagers. And also illustrations as well, which brought a whole new level of joy to seeing book covers come in when they're illustrated. So that's sort of how I landed with it. And with Nightingale, I'm tackling anxiety and grief within that. So I've still kind of maintained that love of tackling those slightly trickier subjects, but with a kind of younger head on, because kids, especially in the last couple of years with everything that happened during COVID and the pandemic, they're well versed in having to deal with, you know, grief and anxiety as well that came from that. So
Yeah, definitely. I agree with like everything that you've said there. And we've also started touching on my next question, which I was going to ask you, which is, what is it in particular about middle grade? But Sophie, I wondered if you had anything that you wanted to add about middle grade in particular.
Yeah, so I was going to say something quite similar, actually, that I think a lot of people think that middle grade means there's no adult topics. But the way I see it is that there's still those adult topics, but it's got to be from a child's point of view, and it's got to be true to them and what they experience and how they would experience that. There obviously are certain things that parents and teachers are not going to like it if you write about. So you do definitely have to leave some of those things out, and you have to think a bit about, like, you know, is this going to really upset a younger child and things like that. But there aren't many topics that are really off limits. I mean, my books have dealt with death and grieving as well a lot. But again, it's just, for me, it's just about dealing with it from that authentic viewpoint, and sensitively as well, and thinking about the effect that it will have for a child reader. And yeah, for me, those are the main differences, because I think you can have a lot of the same themes and genres as YA. You can have basically anything, but it has to be centered on the child.
Yeah, definitely. I was reading an article recently, actually, which was trying to say that YA has very different sort of topics it tackles as opposed to middle grade. And the writer of this article was saying that you can have murder in young adult, but the biggest crime that you can have in middle grade is sort of abduction and kidnapping. And then it mentioned dog napping specifically as well. So yeah, I was just wondering what you thought about that, because I've read so many middle grades where they've got like murder, death, and then this writer was just saying, no, it's got to be the nicer crimes in middle grade. Yeah, Marisa, what did you sort of like think about? Do you know anything to add?
Yeah, I think that's BS. Yeah, I do you know, when my eldest was getting to the age about 3 or 4?
I might have...
Oh, what's that? I'm still here. Can everyone see me? Okay, yeah. Yeah, when I started reading longer stories to my kids, and I remember pulling out Treasure Island and, you know, all these stories that started with the hero as an orphan, you know, whose parents were killed. And I remember at the time thinking, oh, I have to explain that to my 4-year-old, and will he be afraid that then something's going to happen to me? And I remember feeling quite, oh, you know, I loved all these books as a kid, but I hadn't remembered that there was so much death, you know, and it's not even death that happens, it's just backstory. But I think you can pretty much tackle anything, I would say, probably barring sexual aggression in middle grade. It's really how you tackle it. It's what your message is and how you deliver it. You know, you don't want to get too dark and you know, twisty and internal. I think it just depends on how you package it up, and the words and the language that you use, and that kind of frame of reference that you use to make things palatable. Oh, she's gone. Oh no.
Oh, we've lost Madeline.
Oh no, she's back.
I'm back. I lost my internet then.
Oh, you probably didn't hear anything I said.
No. I wasn't even sure actually if you'd actually heard the question that I was asking, so I had no idea at which point my internet cut out.
Yeah. Yeah, I did, and I answered it, unless you want me to go again, or will it hit record?
No, that's fine. It will be in the recording, so I can watch it and catch up. Yeah, Sarah, did you have anything else you wanted to add at this point?
Yeah, that was really, really interesting thought, isn't it? I don't really subscribe to the idea that there are set rules for set genres and age groups, because inevitably there will always be those that break those rules and do it really well. I mean, case in point, let's look at the, you know, Murder Most Unladylike series by Robin Stevens. I mean, it's got murder in the title, so you can have murder in a book for middle grade and be really successful writing those books. It is exactly what the other two were just saying about is how it's handled and how you're putting the child at the center of that, and also thinking about the reader. But generally, kids, I mean, I don't think they're given enough credit for what kids can actually process and deal with. You know, we don't need to coddle them too much. There is a way, you know, there is a line there for sure. But I mean, if you're able to present this in a really accessible, sensitive way, kids can do most topics. So.
Yeah, I think it depends on the kid, doesn't it? And I think yeah, you know, some kids are more sensitive to that than others, and they also don't think the way we do. You know, a lot of things that we might find upsetting kind of just goes over the emotional part of that can go over their heads. So they're not caught up in that in quite the same way that we worry they might be. So go for the murder.
Great. So yeah, this leads really well onto my next question, which is sort of how dark is too dark when you're writing for this audience? Because obviously there are going to be certain situations that you kind of just can't include, because like Sophie was saying, there's going to be parents and teachers that aren't going to want certain topics in these books. So have there ever been any plot lines that you've wanted to include but have either reconsidered it yourself or have been told by an editor not to? And Sophie, would you like to go first with answering this one?
Sure, yeah. This happens quite a lot, I find. I guess not so much with like big plot things, but that has happened. So like with my my Violet Veil, A Case of Grave Danger. So when I originally wrote this, again, it was on my MA that I started it, and my original idea was that Oliver, who is the boy that is discovered by Violet, was going to be buried alive, which is it's pretty horrible. But you know, I got the idea from reading about a lot of sort of Victorian kind of horror things and things about that Victorian fear of that happening. And I was going to start the book with basically they find that and they have to rescue him from a grave, you know. And when I sent this book to my editor, and I had reworked it a bit to be middle grade because it was after I'd written Scarlet and Ivy. But yeah, she was like, we can't do that. It's too scary. And I did get it, and I'd had quite a lot of like adults that had read it for me be like, that's a bit too scary for me. So I was like, fair enough. And I changed it so that it's that he's thought to be dead, but that he then appears to come back to life. So there's none of that really scary bit. So yeah, there's definitely has been those things. And it more often happens with really tiny things that my editor will say like, oh no, that's too dark. And sometimes I can see why, and sometimes it's because like there isn't the space to deal with it. So again, being in the Victorian era, I've occasionally had a mention of something that might be to do with child death or something that's quite you know, a very difficult topic. And then I think even though the reality of the time would be that would be happening a lot, I do kind of have a responsibility to deal with it properly for like modern kids. So yeah, there's been things like that. There's also been the odd thing where my editor has said like, oh no, that's too scary, and I've gone like, what? No, it's not, it's fine. So yeah, it's not always clear cut, I would say.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love hearing sort of like little details and sort of like the behind the scenes of how these plots sort of like happen. Because I'm a YA writer and I'm just working on my first middle grade at the moment, and I'm really conscious of like how I love writing horror stuff. I love writing these really dark, gruesome scenes, and then I keep having to like say to myself, okay, you're writing middle grade now, you can include it, but not to the extent you might have included it if it was YA. Yeah, Sarah, what about you? Have there ever been any plot lines that you've been asked to sort of like hold back on by your editors?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where, you know, editors, I'm a firm believer in that no one person can write a book. Editors just bring so much, a good book, that is. Editors just bring so much to the table, especially, you know, my editor, Lucy Pearce, she bought this book with a really clear idea of exactly what what it's going to look like, what it's going to be. And at the time, it was about grief. It was about the death of Jasper, the main character's sister. That's no spoiler or anything like that. But at the time, when she got the first draft I wrote, the death happened. It happened before the start of the book, but it was almost like a twist at the end. Then we find out that the sister had died, and you had this big kind of oomph moment, which for YA and adult is great because you get that oomph moment and you're able to deal with it. And she made a really good point that, like, for younger children, you kind of need this gradual kind of settling into that. So now it's clear for the most part. Not all kids get it, but it is clear from the beginning what's happened, and you're learning with Jasper as he goes on that journey to realization of what's happened to his sister. So you're kind of following that soft understanding with the character. So it becomes, and it's just made the book everything I actually wanted it to be, but didn't realize that's what I wanted it to be at the beginning. But as I was going through the editorial process, I was like, this is what I wanted to write all along. And she saw that from the beginning and like helped me bring that out. So editors are just fantastic. And one of the best pieces of advice I got, it was actually from YA, but I think it crosses into middle grade as well, is not to go too dark. And I was always like, what does that mean? Like, there's no such thing as too dark. But what they actually mean, what the advice is saying is, if you're going to go dark on one thing, and then don't go dark on too many things. Exactly what you were saying, Sophie, before, is just kind of, if you're going to do something, do it right, give it the space to breathe, explore it to its fullest, and then try not to add in too many other dark elements which detract from the exploration of that central theme. Great advice. I follow that, which is possible.
That's such good advice. I'm going to make a note of that as well, just so like when I'm writing my next draft, I just sort of like have that in the forefront of my mind. I think that would be very helpful. Marisa, what about you?
I'd agree with what you guys said, and I think, I mean, obviously I don't have a MG published at the moment, but my novel Spectrum, these kids are orphans, and they obviously are dealing with that grief as well as their diagnoses, and they have different feelings, as they basically end up going greyhounding across America to find an aunt that they didn't know they have. So it's a journey of hope. They think they've still got a family, so that helps them deal with the loss of their actual parents. And it's also about finding themselves, who they are with their condition. So although they all have their moments where they're contemplating how they feel about the loss of their parent, there's a lot of hope in the book and a lot of positivity. But I think, about going dark, I think maybe like graphic detail, you have to scale back on what you might include in a YA book. I would go into quite a lot of detail with the blood and the whatever, the intestines hanging out, but not so much in a middle grade book. And I was actually laughing. It made me think of a book by Louise Stowell called Otherland. And I remember when she was writing it, she had this discussion with her editor, and in the book there's something about melting babies, which is quite dark, and it's one of those little things, but she managed to keep it. But the image of a baby melting like a candle is actually quite gruesome when you think about it. So it does, sometimes you can get away with these things, and sometimes you have to be more careful. So yeah,
definitely. So I'd love to talk a bit more about the actual writing process now. As we're talking about middle grade stories, it kind of makes sense to ask you all how you get into the mindset of a child when you're writing these characters. Marisa, would you like to go first for this one?
Yeah, well, that was really easy for this particular book because it is based on my kids. So I didn't need much help with that because I understand who they are. I know what they're going to react to. I know what's right for their typical ages. I've got 3 of them, so I've got a lot of age span that I can use. And even what they say, it's been really helpful. And I think, to be honest, the reason I haven't written a lot of middle grade is because I do think it's harder for me to get into a middle grade voice. I'm much more in tune with the young adult voice than I am with the middle grade voice. But when I've got my inspiration right in the same house and I'm living with it, then it was instinctual, right? I didn't have to work too hard at it. It was right there for me. So yeah, the next middle grade might be a bit harder, who knows?
Yeah, so Sarah, what about you then?
Yeah, so I'm what you call a voice writer, which I've been told a few times. It's mainly because I write first person and I change my voice according to who the character is for every single book. So all my books read differently. And I've always written slightly younger voices, even for my YA voices. They're both on the more innocent, most childlike persona, and it's just that they've had very difficult things to deal with, so it kind of balances each other out into YA. So I kind of have always written that kind of voice anyway, but the way I kind of get into the zone is, I mean, I read a lot for sure. You have to read as much middle grade as you possibly can. What a joy. There's some amazing middle grade books out there at the moment. And the other thing is I do a lot of character work, such as like Q&As. I do 100 questions for your character and get into the mindset of them that way. I also do personality quizzes for my characters as well and get to know who they are on their kind of Myers-Briggs personality. And then also for fun, mainly, is I do the Pottermore quizzes. So I sort them into their houses and I give them a Patronus. And that really does help, even though it is a little bit of procrastination. It really does help me understand how they would react to certain things and what kind of, animal they're associated with. And all these things help me identify voice notes, which I use throughout. So do they repeat words? Do they use long sentences, short sentences? Do they have a certain turn of phrase that they use a lot? And how would they, these kind of things. And there's a really good blog actually on voice for anyone who's interested. If you Google Annabelle Pritchard, amazing middle grade voice writer, Annabelle Pritchard voice blog, it comes up on a blog. I think it's Liz Banks's blog spot. It comes up on there. It's quite old now, but it's my go-to resource for anyone who's interested in learning more about voice, because she really does lay it out perfectly.
That sounds great. So yeah, I'm definitely going to check out that blog. And I love the idea of doing the Pottermore quizzes for your characters. That just sounds great. And like you say, it's a bit of procrastination as well to do, but kind of still counts as writing and as work. So that's even better.
Exactly. I'll take as much as I can on that.
Yeah. So Sophie, what about you?
Yeah. So I guess kind of similarly to what Sarah said before. I've been writing ever since I was a kid, and I think that my voice and the way I write has stayed quite similar the whole way through. And I know, like I say, I was kind of trying to write YA, and people were telling me, no, this is middle grade. So it seemed like that was kind of naturally the way I was writing. I think it helps that I remember being a kid well. A lot more than I remember being a teenager, because I have a chronic illness and I was ill since I was like 12. So a lot of being a teenager is very chaotic and I don't remember it that well. Whereas like being a kid for me was like a fun, exciting time, and something that I remember well. So there's that side of it. It's easier to think that way for me. And as well, I think generally it's about remembering that children are clever and, interesting and all these things. They just don't have the experiences that we have. Because I think a trap that some people fall into is to be really patronizing, or to kind of just see kids as like two-dimensional. Whereas, yeah, so that's the way I treat it, as I just treat it as it's a character, it's a whole person, but it's just an inexperienced character, and as well, another thing that I would advise people to kind of remember is the feeling of like powerlessness as a kid. It's something that comes up in my books like all the time, because there's always adults who kind of have the power, and I think that's something that's really helpful to get into that mindset, is to remember that feeling of the kind of the adults being in control. But equally, at the same time, there is kind of, you have your own kind of power as a kid. You have ways you can get around it, and things that you can do. So yeah, that's the kind of dichotomy that I think of a lot when trying to think of how to get into the kid mindset.
Yeah, that's such a good point as well about sort of the powerlessness that like children have. Yeah, I hadn't sort of thought too much about that, but yeah, totally right. Yeah, so I'd love to just sort of like talk a bit more about sort of the drafting process. We've touched on it before about how sometimes like the readership that you're aiming your story at can sort of dictate or change the structure that you're using compared to young adult. So Sarah and Marisa, because you both write young adult and middle grade and are publishing in both of those readerships, do you approach these books and their structures from like completely different viewpoints, or do you sort of start off the same and then just let the story sort of go where it wants to go? Yeah, Marisa, did you want to go first with this one?
Yeah, sure. I do approach it in the same way. When I first started writing Spectrum, I mean, it was quite early on in my career, so I didn't even think about what age group it was. And, you know, obviously now I know more, I know it's fairly middle grade. But it was like 80,000 words to start with. And I thought, oh God, I really need to cut this down because that's not going to fly. So I think that the hardest part for me with middle grade is the word count, because I do like a longer book. But I do approach them the same way. And I start by looking at my character and their wants and their needs and what their central conflict is. And once I've got their arc, then I map that against the plot and what's happening. And that seems to work in both age ranges for me. What was harder about the middle grade, because it's actually 3 points of view, which isn't that common in middle grade, but because it is evenly divided between these three kids, I felt they all needed their own voice. It wasn't just one of their stories. So I trying to make sure, and I have written other books with, you know, more than one point of view, but not quite so balanced. So trying to make sure that, you know, it rotated and they had their alternative chat, but that it also wasn't just a filler chapter, you know, was quite challenging for me. So that took a little bit more work in a structural point of view of thinking about where the beats are hitting and more in the editing to get that right. But largely I approach them in the same way, actually. Yeah,
that's really interesting. No, I found that when I'm doing my middle grade series, I am approaching it in sort of the same way, but then once I'm writing it, I found I'm writing it in a very different way. So I'm just really curious about what your answers will be for this. Sarah, what about you?
Yeah, kind of similar actually, in that I have the same rough idea of how these things go from between YA and middle grade. And it's usually that I'm struck with an idea, I spend a long time chewing it in my head, and I use the word chew because it really feels like you're like almost like your jaw hurts from having to chew this idea. And then I do a lot of research is like usually my next step. So I'll do a good couple of months. I'm in that stage at the moment for my next novel that I'm writing. It's just kind of researching, getting out there and trying to do some of the things I need to do in order to know, like at the moment I'm trying to learn how to drive a boat for that. So I'm trying to source someone with a boat. If anyone has a boat, let me know. So things like that I'll do, and then I'll do the voice work and start with the character, like you were saying, Marisa, before then, thinking about how that maps onto the usual the journey. I use the hero's arc when I'm plotting. So kind of do the 3-act structure through that, and I kind of plot roughly that kind of, and because I write adventure mainly, they plot quite nicely onto that. But I find that all my books are completely different. So although that is the plan for most of it, I'll also find that, like, I mean, I've written 9 books now. I'm about to start my 10th book. I mean, I haven't had all those published, but all of them have been. I was like, I should know what I'm doing by now. I should know how this works. And then every book is just so different, and something will come up, and I'm like, yeah, I've forgotten how to plot.
Yeah.
I've forgotten how to avoid the inevitable soggy middle that I get in all of my books. So I always say now that I do a ditch draft. I write the draft. I wrote Nightingale in a week, actually, which, seeing as I work full time and I'm a carer as well. I don't know how I managed to do that in a week, and then and then I just ditch it and then start it again. That's the plan, and it takes that pressure off, not having to, get it right first time.
Hold back up here. Do you not look at that at all, and you just start again?
So
or do you use chunks? Yeah,
I tell myself that I'm ditching it. I'm just throwing it in the bin. But that just takes the pressure off. But what I actually do is I've got 2 screens, so I keep my ditch draft up on one screen, and then a blank document on here, and I will paste over any good parts from that document. But the idea is to start from scratch, so you're not starting with words that are already there, and you're giving yourself that freedom to write the words that need to be there, not the words that are already there. I don't recommend it. It takes forever.
That's hard.
Yeah, it is hard.
I'd be tempted just to copy and paste it all. That's fine. Yeah,
I know. I'm too much of a perfectionist though. Like, I'm like, no, the story needs to be right, and the words are just bogging me down. But yeah, maybe
we've all got our process, don't we? So, and I agree with you about, I've got so many books that I've written, and I have a way that I like to approach them, but then I'll read a craft book and think, oh, I'm going to try that and see if that adds anything in. But there's always something a bit different, or I'll get stuck and think, oh, how do I get myself out of? That's the one thing about writing thrillers, I think, is that you try and do as many bad things as you can to your characters, and you put them in a bind, and then you don't have to get them out again, So, yeah, tricky.
Yeah. So yeah, Sophie, I'd like to talk with you about your writing process, because obviously you've written, this is your second series that you're doing now, and I think your first series had 6 books in it. So I was just wondering, did your writing process, and in particularly whether like how you're structuring your novels, did it change from sort of early on in your series to the later ones, or did you sort of outline the whole series in advance?
Okay, so I definitely didn't outline the whole series in advance because I didn't know it was going to be a series.
Okay.
I submitted the first book, and the publisher said, like, this reads like the first one of a series. Can you make it a series? So I really had to go what George R. R. Martin calls the gardener route of like planting seeds of things that could then come back later. And that was pretty much how I did the whole of Scarlet and Ivy. Because as well, I had a contract for 3 books, and then after that was just like question mark. So when I was writing the 3rd book, I had to write it as if it was both the midpoint and the final book. So that was really hard because I was like, it's kind of got to work as both. It's got to tie up enough things in case I don't get the contract renewed, and it's also got to have things that I can use if I move on. But at least it's not too bad with a mystery series that's kind of episodic. Each book is quite a self-contained mystery, so I didn't feel like it would be terrible to not have this whole series planned out, because I had some vague ideas about where it was going, and I had things that I was setting up. Yes, and it's been pretty similar with Violet Vale as well. I did start out like knowing that they wanted it to be a series, but again, there's that kind of uncertainty of like, how many books is this going to be and things. So yeah, it's ended up with a similar approach where I've got ideas, I've got a rough kind of outline of where things might be going, but it's more about doing each mystery by itself.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense, and making sure that each of them has like the standalone potential. I guess there's also a lot of like children, they might not know the series order, or they might just come across a book that's later on in the series. I know when I was reading the famous 5 books when I was really younger, I didn't actually realise like they had a set order to start with, because like I was just so excited to find any of them, but I was just reading them in like pretty random order. I mean, it was only later on that I then read them in order and found that by reading them in order it added to sort of like the overall picture, but I was still able to get enjoyment from each of the books no matter which order that I'd read them in.
Yeah, that was quite the intention with mine as well. Even though they do follow on, there are definitely kids reading them out of order, and they mention it in their letters, like, "Oh, I read the 3rd one first," or whatever. So even though we started putting numbers on Scarlet and Ivy, but it still doesn't seem to help. So again,
I think it's clever if you can make it do both.
That's another thing you have to think about as well, is writing it so that you can kind of sum up what's previously happened without it spoilering the previous book. So again, that's another kind of tightrope to walk, because you want a kid who's just picked it up to be able to go, oh, okay, that's the like essential backstory, but to not just completely spoil the previous mystery that they haven't read yet.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, we've been talking quite a lot in this panel about different tips and tricks that middle grade writers can use when they're writing. So I was just wondering if any of you had any more tips and tricks to share, maybe for someone who is just wanting to start out writing a middle grade story who hasn't actually written for this audience before. Marisa, would you like to go first?
I think yeah, sure. I think it's common advice really, and that is just to read the genre. See what's popular, see how it's written, see what kind of subjects are dealt with, what kind of voice there is, and I think that gives you a really good insight into what you can include and what you can't include. And beyond that, also just hang out in a playground or hang out by a school fence, but without looking stalkerish, and listen to some kids, or if you have got kids, listen to them, and not necessarily about the particular slang that they're using, but just, the types of things that make them laugh. What kind of sense of humor do they have? Because I think a lot of middle grade books have that underlying sense of humor, whether it's a total funny book or it's just those moments that you have. So understanding, I think, what makes kids laugh is quite an important thing to try and figure out, and also know what their fears are. I know each one of mine have gone through a phase, I think about 8 or 9, when they became afraid of meteorites and space and things like that, and the Earth just being annihilated. It's actually quite a common fear especially among boys at that age. So just to maybe have a little understanding of what kind of fears those kids have as they're starting to see themselves outside their family as proper little humans, is a good idea to try and research that. Not always easy, but yeah,
that's such great advice. Just sort of being able to relate to the different things that your readers are going to also be sort of worrying about or going through. Sarah, what about you? Have you got any tips or tricks that you want to share that we've not yet talked about?
Yeah, I mean, the read one is always the one that comes up, and is completely right. I would say one thing I was doing was reading current middle grade books, not the old style ones, but the most current ones that are just being published. But then reading it with your English GCSE hat on. So thinking about like how they work, why they work, what are the characters doing, what are the beats of the story, and really trying to pick apart things like language structure, plot, and character, and all those things that kind of you will need to bring to your own book. And then thinking about how they're working in some of the books that you're enjoying reading when you're reading the middle grade ones. And then really thinking about, where the story fits in that you're trying to write, where does that fit into that market? You don't want to have your writing for market hat on too much, because I can feel that sometimes that squishes the creativity down a little bit. But it is really important to have an idea of what kind of books are relevant at the moment. And that's that kind of, reading current stuff rather than like the Enid Blyton and stuff. That's really good to read, and they're excellent. But like if you're trying to write for contemporary children, you need to be reading contemporary books. So that's been my main tip. And then the other one is when it comes to getting it published, which is important when you finally got that through, is not waiting too long to send it out to get it in front of an agent. So I speak to a lot of writers who spend 10 years on a book, polishing it and making it wonderful, only to then find out that when they do get an agent, they have to edit it maybe, another 10 times. When their editor, when they finally get that publishing deal, they need to edit another 10 times, and suddenly it's a completely different book to how it was before when you thought it was ready. So get it into the best standard you think you can do, and then send it out, start getting feedback, and then go from there.
Yeah, that's such great advice. Sophie, do you have anything else that you'd like to add?
Yeah, so I think those is really great pieces of advice. On a kind of similar line, I was going to say, write something that you want to see in the world. I think that's a good way of putting it, because that means like take a look at what's out there, and see what you think is kind of missing, and then write that thing that you really want to exist, because that's kind of the best of both worlds, I think. And that's kind of what I did with my books. And obviously there's no guarantee that it'll work, because you might write something you really love and people go, oh no, that's completely out of trend or whatever. But I think it's a helpful way to look at it. Like say, it's not just market driven. It's not just saying like, oh, I need to write that because like people want that. But it's keeping the market in mind and saying like, I'm not seeing that out there, but that's something I'd love and I'd want that to be out there. So yeah, I think that is a really important thing. And a sort of writing focused thing I wanted to throw out there, and I think someone mentioned something a bit like this before, and it is extremely basic advice, but this is the thing that really helps me, is just think like, what does your main character want? What do they need? And who is standing in the way of that? Yeah. And I think that when I start like basically any story, I just think it's a really good starting place, and it tells you so much, and it tells you basically what the whole arc is going to be, like what the character is trying to get and what they really need from life and who the villain is and all those things. It's just three very simple questions, but it's really helpful for any book that you're doing.
It is. Oh, maybe Madeline's frozen. Not sure. I agree with you, Sophie. I do that as well. I think that's really, and sometimes I get myself into a knot about it, because sometimes what they want right at the beginning isn't the same as in chapter 3, when all the stuff kicks off. But yeah, it's I think it's a really, I always start there as well. I think it's a really good place to get that central conflict going. Yeah, definitely. I think we have lost Madeline again. Yeah, we have. There we go.
I've got a question for both of you whilst Madeline is joining again. What is it that you're working on at the moment? What's the next steps from a middle grade perspective for both of you?
I have something that I'm actually writing with my son. So he really loved, he's 9, and he loved the 13-story treehouse books. So he definitely likes stuff with the funny. So we had come up with the idea of doing something with a similar sense of humour, but calling it the Cave Boy Chronicles, about Craig the cave boy who lives in cave boy times. And it's all about, like, the first book is about his coming of age and the ceremony and going on his first hunt with his dad and the other cave kids, and one's the know-it-all and one's the, doesn't do anything, and all those typical stereotypes that you would get at school. So slowly we are writing that together, and I need him because I'm not naturally funny. So he helps me with all the things that 9-year-olds find funny, that I can throw into the book. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. Yeah. Middle grade wise. What about you, Sophie?
Yeah, so sorry, Madeline, we kind of got into the last question by ourselves.
That's fine. I don't know what's going on with my internet.
Yeah, so I'm working on the 3rd book in my Violet Vale mysteries, which at the moment is going to be called A Case of High Stakes. but it might change because my titles change all the time. Yeah, so again, it's an interesting kind of third book because I've got that thing again of I'm not sure if there's going to be more of these, so I've got to do a bit of like an epic conclusion and some tying things up, but also leave some of those things unsaid. Yeah, so just been working on that at the moment, and I've done the planning, and I've just kind of got started in writing it. So yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Good.
Yeah, I'm working on the second contracted middle grade that I have. It's always funny when you're talking about your next project because you're like, how much can I say? Or am I going to get told off? But no, I mean, it's another standalone contemporary middle grade, but it's got a slight magic realism to it in that there are ghost animals as part of it. So but actually it's a kind of look at PTSD in parents, specifically after the pandemic, when a lot of people, a lot of paramedics are getting suffering from PTSD from that, and then the effect that has on children. So I've been exploring things like what haunting means and that kind of memory thing, and how things that can happen can leave this footprint behind on us, and thinking about exploring that through friendship and ghost animals as well. So I'm just going through edits on that, and then thinking about writing at sea next time, because I really want to see what my illustrator does at sea with her illustrations.
Lovely.
Yeah, that all sounds wonderful. Yeah, I mean, all of you have mentioned the importance of reading middle grade and reading the books that are currently being published. I just wanted to ask you quickly, what are you currently reading? So, Marisa, would you like to go first?
So in the middle grade, I'm reading Loki by Louis Stowell, and then Nizana's new book, The Girl Who Lost a Leopard, and a friend of mine, Sally, who's got Toby and the Silverwood Witches, which I absolutely adore. I think it's just amazing. So yeah, that's what I've been reading very recently, and a lot more on the list. So fab, yeah. The Big Wolf Conspiracy, I like that series. Lots and lots of things, yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm just going to be making notes of all these titles that you're recommending, because it just gives me an excuse to buy more books. So what can be better than that? Sophie, what have you been reading recently?
So I just finished the third book in the Land of Raw series, which is by Jenny McLaughlin, I think, and I absolutely love those so much. I think it was the last one, which makes me sad, because it was really brilliant. And for me, it's just one of those ideas that I wish I'd come up with. And for anyone who doesn't know, it's about some kids who discover that the imaginary land they made up when they were younger is actually real, and they can go there. And there's just all these just really hilarious things that like young kids would come up with. Like their best friend is called Win Ninja because he's a wizard ninja, and things like that. And there's all these just really hilarious things, and it's so perfect. And I can just imagine that kids must love it, because that idea of like all these fun things I've imagined could actually be real, and you could have a cool adventure. So there's that, and the other thing I've been reading is the Strange Worlds Travel Agency series by L.D. Lipinski, which again, another idea that I'm like, that's just an amazing idea in itself. They have the suitcases that you can climb into and travel to different worlds. Again, I'm really enjoying that series as well. It's got awesome representation, it's funny, and it's just got amazing worlds in it. So it's a really cool series.
Oh, that sounds amazing. Sarah, what about you?
Yeah, well, I've just kind of finished 2 books, actually. It just made me think that I'm not reading anything at the moment, but I've recently finished 2. One is from my brilliant Carnegie-winning friend, Katja Ballen, who's got a new book out with Barrington Stoke in July called Birdsong. and it's everything wonderful about her writing, but in a dyslexic friendly way. So I do really recommend that. You learn so much about blackbirds and how amazing they are, and how they connect to music, and it just feels wonderful. It's a lovely short tale, really fantastic, and the illustrations look beautiful as well. And then I've also just finished Pax as well by Sarah Pennypacker. So I've been recommended that a lot, and it was really interesting actually about what we were talking about, the rules of middle grade. I think it's kind of middle grade YA crossover, but it definitely breaks some of those rules of middle grade about what you can have in there. You know, like even simple things like the main character breaks his leg at the beginning. And it was one of those things where I was writing my adventure stories, like I can't ever get my character too hurt because of those things. And then here he is breaking his leg and being in tremendous pain. So it's really interesting. What rules? No such thing.
Great. So yeah, before we go, do each of you just want to tell sort of like readers, teachers, where they can find you online? Sarah, do you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am at Sarah and Juckes on Twitter, and just to point out that my name has a weird C in it, so sometimes that makes it difficult to find me. I'm on Instagram at SAJuckes, and my website is sarahandjuckes.com as well. So hopefully a Google should bring all of those things up.
Wonderful. Sophie?
Yeah, I am on most things as either Sophie Cleverly or Hap Fairy, like HAP Fairy. It's been my username for like 20 years. And my website is sophiecleverly.com. So if you go there, you can find all my links to my other things anyway.
Great.
Yeah.
And Marisa?
Yeah, same. My website's marisanoelle.com, and that links to everything. But I am on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. I'm everywhere as Marisa Noelle, either 77 or 12. Yeah, because there's that many of us apparently. So yeah, I'm not hard to find. Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you to all of you for joining me for this panel. It's been so informative, and I've had so much fun chatting with you all about writing middle grade. So thank you.